Ready to explore the extraordinary world of tech? Welcome to the X-Tech Podcast, where we connect you with the sharpest minds and leading voices in the global tech community. Join us as we cut through the complexity to give you a clear picture of the ideas, innovations, and insight that are shaping our future.
Hello and welcome to X-Tech Podcast by Fox Agency. I'm your host, Debbie Forster MBE. I'm a tech portfolio consultant and an advocate and campaigner for diversity, inclusion, and innovation in the tech industry. I'm delighted to be working with Fox Agency as the host for the X-Tech Podcast and as a curator for the X-Tech community. Now today, I'm delighted to be joined by Alex Hammond, the head of communications at Nuvei. Welcome, Alex. It's great to have you here today.
It's great to be here. Very happy to be on.
Thanks. Now, what we like to do here is to start by understanding you a little bit more as a human before we get into the world of tech. So, Alex, some of my guests were born with the laptop in hand. Others of us woke up one day and found that they were in the world of tech. How about you? How did you get in?
I went to university to study law. I thoroughly enjoyed elements of that, and it was a good grounding in the way to kind of present material in an engaging way. I left university. Or I should say, I did graduate from university. I didn't leave university. I graduated university with the intention of becoming a professional poker player. Surprise, surprise, didn't go as well as it had done in my dreams. That experience gave me access to a lot of high-level poker players. I was at a lot of tournaments, a lot of events, stuff like that. And I sort of got back into writing sort of through sort of consumer journalism. And then that sort of piqued my interest in kind of the gambling industry as a whole. And I sort of transitioned into B2B journalism from there. Sort of not really looked back since. So I worked in financial markets B2B. I worked in payments B2B journalism. After about 10 years of being a journalist, decided to make the leap into the world of corporate communications. Firstly, for a payments company called PaySafe, who was heavily involved in providing payments for the gambling industry. The online gambling industry in particular is incredibly focused, built on payments. It's pretty much the bedrock of how the online gambling industry works. Started there and I was there for 4 years. And then 4 years ago, I moved to Nuvei to be the head of communications here.
Lovely. So you are my first guest who was let's call you a semi-professional gambler, right? I like that.
I would say I was a winning player, but not a professional player.
Okay, which is probably better. I think, if you're going to pick your adjectives, that's a better one to do. Okay, super. So what did you find that transition from one side of the fence to the other, from the journalist to a communications professional? Were there some advantages to you when you came across?
So look, I think the first thing I would say, right, is that I had some fantastic mentors in the space, right? So Kate Aldridge and Anna Bertelstrong, who were kind of the head of communications at PaySafe when I joined, they were fantastic in kind of getting me to speed in stuff, not least because they kind of let me do what I was good at in the first instance, right? So I was brought in sort of with the mindset of we want an in-house journalist. So we want somebody on our comms team who has that sort of journalistic slant, who can essentially digitally walk around the business, find interesting stories and help us place content either on our blog or through earned media opportunities. So the introduction was a pretty soft landing. It didn't really change much of my day to day. And then I guess the other thing I would say was I joined, 2017, and I spent 2 years with my mouth shut, sitting next to people who knew what they were doing, and sort of had the attitude of be a sponge. And kind of that was how I got up to speed on a lot of the sort of nuts and bolts of the corporate world, in the comms world, all of that kind of stuff. So that was kind of how I made the transition, I guess.
And I think there's the key. There's two things I want to draw out from what you've said there. The first one is thinking about that comms, because I always remember when I have worked with comms professionals that always needing to be reminded, the journalists, so what? That we've got to get past that, so what? And so you would have had a lot of bad pitches to you, and you think that helped sharpen the pitches you then tried to make?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm sure it's even more difficult now, right? I'm talking about closing in on 10 years ago. But even back then, the volume of pitches that you'd receive was unbelievable in terms of, especially, something like the fintech industry, which has got lots and lots of different areas, avenues that, if you're a relatively broad fintech media publication, you could easily be getting dozens of press releases a day. There's some very autopilot filtering that goes on, I guess, because to survive as a journalist in that environment, it's almost inevitable that you make snap decisions in sort of second on a lot of the pitches that you get.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the things that you were talking about, that was interesting because you were going around trying to find interesting stories, not starting from, here's the message we want to get out. I think sometimes if we start with the message we want to get out, the so what is the hurdle. But if you start with it something that is interesting, you're already starting to pry that door open slightly.
Yeah, I agree. And my sort of route into a comms team, almost requested into the world of comms from being a journalist, made that sort of transition quite smooth, because that was kind of what I was there to do. I know comms professionals from other companies, other industries that really struggle with that. I think comms professionals in general know this, that they need to create stories that resonate with audiences, right? But when you sit within a broader marketing team where, potentially a different set of broader KPIs that are really focused on performance marketing and, ROI and what revenue you're bringing into the business and all of that kind of stuff, you can get to a point quite quickly where you become an arm of the sales team, right? And you're less focused on what is that secret sauce that will unlock actual audience engagement in what you're trying to say.
And I think that's what I want to come back to a second. The other thing that you mentioned that I want to just put as an aside for us to think about, that when you're listening to this, is I am a huge fan of working remotely. I am a huge fan of hybrid working. But I think the one thing we always need to think about, that is a great way to keep people productive. But we do need to think then about how do we do what you were describing, that sponge period in which we're trying to soak up as much information as possible. And I think when we're setting up teams, when we're bringing on new ones, and particularly the more junior the role, but for anyone new, we have to get more intentional, don't we, about how do we get across how we work, the way we work, our ethos, our values, our ways of working. And that's something to put to the side. But back to your more interesting point, in thinking about what I like that you were talking about is how do we reconcile the different things of marketing versus comms versus everything? I mean, from your perspective and where you are right now, how unified are the content and the comms strategies in an organization?
Well, I think it's not always the case, but the comms team that I lead sits within the marketing function. So there's some clear objectives of us, just through that. And actually the head of content marketing and I, we both report into the same SVP. So we are very much kind of in lockstep on a lot of stuff. I think there's some really good reasons for that. Quite often we are looking at very similar topics in terms of industry trends and where things are progressing and where Nuvei sits in the broader ecosystem and what our core brand messaging should be and all of that kind of stuff. So that, I think, makes a lot of sense for us to kind of digitally sit side by side. Where there is sometimes tension, and it's kind of what I alluded to already, right, is there needs to be a balance between performance marketing and brand marketing. And when you sit in the broader marketing team, when you sort of level up to kind of the marketing function as a whole, the key metric, right, is how much money are you bringing into the building. And I'm sure every one of these interviews you've done with a comms professional will tell you the same thing. Like, measurement is the hardest element of what
Absolutely.
we do, right?
Absolutely.
You're either you need to have faith. You kind of demonstrating what comms does as a commercial exercise is beyond incredibly difficult, right? So
we should start probably offering a cash bounty for anyone that can finally come up with the magic metric that does that. So you'll have heard from it first here.
Yeah, I've said to people on multiple occasions, if you can show me revenue generation, if you can show me positive ROI on comms activity, then I've got an unlimited budget for you.
Yeah,
honestly,
yeah.
I'll write you a bank check. But if you can't, it's a very, very different picture I've got to paint for you, unfortunately.
Comm wars begin now. We'll let everyone fight it out.
Yeah, that's where I have to fight my corner against content marketing a little bit. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And how then does GEO start impacting this? Is it a help? Is it going to force it together? What impact are you seeing of GEO?
Well, I mean, my perspective is that geo is a godsend to the comms community. That's my philosophy, right? And I think geo itself is a bit of a black box. Like, I don't think anybody who tells you they've got the answers as to how geo works. Good for them, I guess. But I'm going to take that with a massive pinch of salt. But my understanding, my philosophy, everything that I've read, and what I am evangelizing in our business, right, is the shift from SEO to GEO is a shift from owned content to external channel content, right? So whereas an SEO strategy was traditionally managed by a content marketing team, and because it's all about how you leverage your own content and SEO optimize it, you can't generate 1/10 of the impact with owned content as you can with credible external citations, which essentially boils down to media coverage.
Brings you to the front of the bus, right? You're no longer at the back of the bus, are you?
Yeah, and look, going back to what I was saying before about you need people in your corner understand, having faith in what you do. Actually, geo is an incredibly easy thing to explain across the business in terms of this is something it's measurable. We can visibly see the impact. Everybody understands the importance of it, and that's what I mean when I say it's a real bonus for comms teams to kind of be able to lead that type of activity.
Okay, so that makes sense about GEO. But if we think a little more broadly, what would you say your biggest marketing challenges are at the moment?
There's a couple. I mean, I think so. How do we better leverage our tier one customers in our overall marketing campaigns? And that obviously includes comms. I think there's an imbalance, but especially when you're talking about kind of PR and that type of activity, there's generally an imbalance when you're looking at doing a sort of announcement content around winning new business. There's a lot of pushback, particularly from kind of the big international brands, which are our kind of key sort of customer demographic. What do I get out of this? Not only what do I get out of it, but also slippery slope argument. If I do this for you, then I'm going to be doing this every day.
Yeah, and time is money. So what is it? What is their return?
You got to think outside the box in terms of how do you tackle that subject. I mean, I don't know who coined the expression, the answer to all your questions is money, but I find it works in quite a lot of circumstances. So look, and we see people in the industry take that approach, whether that's something to do with fees, or whether it's something to do with enabling paying for co-marketing opportunities that are advantageous to the customer. We kind of want to take a more creative approach to it. My philosophy is if you create a piece of content that not only enables your partners to get across the messages that they want to get across, because obviously they've got comms teams and they've got comms objectives as well, but that you do it in a way that makes you inseparable from the concept. So you come up with something that is got the creative chops to really sort of stand out from kind of the run of the mill ideas. Then that's how you get traction in that area. It's a really you've got to be honest about these things. It's a really hard uphill battle to kind of get some of that stuff over the line. I mean, the second challenge that I would say is an interesting challenge. It's not a daunting challenge, is the way that the media landscape is changing. I think there's a lot of scarce statistics around about the drop off in audiences for tier one, tier two media titles. My view on that is that the desire for information is not changing, right? It's just that the media landscape is changing, and actually some of the democratization, some of the removing of the gatekeepers around content is interesting. It's a good thing. You've seen the rise of B2B influencers on LinkedIn. That's kind of one thing that's relatively, it's not new, but it's relatively new. Certainly it was not something when I got into comms 8 years ago that we considered at all.
LinkedIn is unrecognizable from where it was 5 years ago.
I mean, other media channels, you can get fintech content on TikTok these days. Obviously, stuff like Substack and, the growth of kind of independent journalism is something that's really interesting as well. So that's the challenge for comms professionals, really, just to keep on top of where the media landscape is, where the audiences are. As I say, I don't think it's an issue of people are no longer engaging in content. And if your argument is, well, actually people just get their information from ChatGPT, they don't get it from media sources anymore, I would say, well, where do you think ChatGPT gets it from?
I was just going to say Follow that argument all the way through and you've got your answer.
That's still your audience. You still need to be telling the right stories in the right places to reach an audience, even within the ecosystem of ChatGPT.
And to some degree, you could almost argue it brings the art back in, because, too much and too literal use of SEO just becomes about the numbers game, doesn't it? And a very mechanical process, where if media is changing to really meet the demands of GEO, you've got to get your message other places. That creativity that you were talking about keeps us in play and keeps it an interesting job, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I'm fortunate that I have never kind of overseen SEO strategy, because I despise that type of content, to be honest.
With all due respect
maybe
to all the
maybe
SEO
that's a bit
experts
strong.
out there, yeah.
Maybe that's a bit strong for this podcast, but as somebody who grew up in the world of journalism and kind of wants to write lovely, silky flowing content,
Yeah.
it's not something that I'd like to be my bread and butter.
Okay, so let's step back then a little bit. One of the things I noticed when I was prepping for the show is Nuvei's made some bold early bets on agentic commerce. The idea that autonomous AI agents are increasingly going to conduct transactions on behalf of customers, businesses, etc. Now, how do you do that? What's been your approach trying to create and define a whole new category?
Well, look, let me start by saying, when I first got into comms 9 years ago, I invested a huge amount of my time in writing about smart cities and smart fridges and the way that payments was going to transform how we went to the supermarket, because you'd be able to pick stuff up and just walk out, and, you wouldn't need to pay for petrol. You could just fill up your car and leave, and all of that kind of stuff. And very little of that has actually come to fruition, almost a decade later.
Yeah, when I try and walk out of the shops without paying, they don't buy that. They don't think it's very smart. So
No, exactly. So look, I think you have to look at some of this stuff through that lens. But look, it's certainly true that there's consensus around this idea that e-commerce is shifting away from, we saw the shift from e-commerce into mobile first, and that we're going to shift again into agentic commerce. What that necessarily looks like, I think, is not expressly clear, whether that will be using a large language model like ChatGPT, or whether independent e-commerce outlets will build their own agents, and sort of keep some of that data that, of you as an individual for personalization purposes to themselves. But that conversation is ongoing, right? I think where we look at it as Nuvei is we want to be in part of that conversation, but we want to be part of that conversation as a builder rather than somebody who sort of talks about it. So we were maybe sort of slightly behind some of our competitors who I think when they were just doing SEO grabs on the term agentic commerce, just saying kind of this is the future, but not a lot of substance. We want to put more meat on our story there. So we're sort of not quite in the moment where I can talk about this yet, because we do have some big announcements coming in the next kind of 6 weeks or so. But our comm strategy really is around kind of taking those ideas around agentic commerce from the hypothetical and actually putting some substance on how we're going to build it.
So what I'm hearing feels really sensible, because there's always going to be a dozen potential hype curves, and you don't want to be in the one that ends up in the dead end. So I'm hearing that you stay in the conversations, but you're not just talking, like you say, getting the SEO grabs. You're waiting until there is something substantial to talk about that's real. Avoid the buzz until you have something properly to bring into the conversation. But you're staying part of the conversation. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. And look, to go back to kind of some of the comms 101 that we talked about at the beginning, right? Like you talk about the so what factor. It's very easy to kind of stand there and wave your arms about and say, we think that the future of e-commerce is agentic commerce, and then not be able to kind of go more than surface deep on that, right? So
wave your arms around too much and you just look like the crazy person, right?
Well, and you wasting your own time, because 9 times out of 10 nobody's listening.
Yeah.
For us to take a much more practical approach to something, to a topic like agentic commerce, I think that's just an eminently sensible approach, regardless of what topic in tech you're talking to.
Now let's look at another thing where I think Nuvei is making some strategic choices. You are in specific verticals: gaming, construction, hospitality, connected vehicles, EV charging. How do you maintain awareness and reputation across such a diverse range of verticals without spreading yourself too thin?
So it's interesting. It's interesting you say that, right? So as I talked about a tension between content marketing and comms, like there is a second tension within comms itself, right? Which is, how do we support those commercial efforts versus how do we tell the broader story? Obviously, the way that you support commercial efforts, kind of in the immediate term, is by showcasing the big tier one customers that you win, right? I talk to our director of sales quite a lot, and he always says, I don't get out of a meeting without him saying to me, to grow our book, we've got to show our book, right?
Nice.
So that's how we contribute to the commercial effort. And that necessarily means that you end up speaking to specific verticals. And as you said, you've highlighted a couple there. Travel is a big vertical where we feel we have the right to win. It helps us win more travel business if we talk to the travel business that we've already won. But if you zoom out of that, it is incredibly important for us as a business, and from a corporate communications perspective, and from an investor relations perspective, or an investor communications perspective, I should say, to not get pigeonholed into specific verticals. So we have a very, very fundamental belief that we are a vertical agnostic payment service provider. We're one of the top 5 payment providers in the world, and we do serve key verticals as a leader in the payment space, but we also have a lot of business across an incredibly wide range of verticals, including general e-com platforms, marketplaces. So we've recently launched our new brand position, Every Payment Everywhere, which kind of encapsulates some of our idea around being vertical agnostic, also mode agnostic, model agnostic. That is very much how we see ourselves. That is a core component of the overall brand position. So yeah, it's an interesting dilemma for us as a comms team to try and support those commercial initiatives with specificity as to how our solution operates, but also being able to tell that industry agnostic story at the same time.
Lovely. All right. The real balancing act. Right. So, I mean, we could probably do this all day. I think we've covered so much, and I've really, really enjoyed a lot of the things. You've given me a lot to think about. Alex, I love to finish up by returning to you as the human. So, what's in general on the horizon is grabbing your interest, good or bad, in tech?
I mean, I think we've covered a lot of it already, right? So I don't know if I can give you a fresh answer. I think that piece around how the media landscape is changing, and geo obviously rolls up into that. Where do you find audiences now in 2026? Like, are those audiences just are they held within LLMs? If they are, how do you access them? How is that democratization of kind of the media landscape affecting where your audience shows up? Obviously, every day your audience demographic changes, right? Like the average age of readers when I started 8 years ago is different from the average age now. Like is there going to be a time where TikTok is the primary way to connect with your audience? I hope not, because I don't even have a TikTok account. But is it? I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sort of being slightly flippant there,
No.
but I think that's the thing that's interesting. I think that's the thing that makes the role of the comms team
Interesting.
exciting. Yeah.
Good. And then, again, your human self. I love to fill my list of things to read or watch or listen to. Do you have something you could recommend to me that you've really enjoyed or has really offered value for you?
So look, the caveat is, I have a 2-year-old and a 3-month-old child. So unless you want me to go deep on the moral learnings of Bluey,
if you want to send me an email on favorite episodes on Bluey, I'll follow up on that as well. But something for the other non-parent of small children's in the audience.
I've just started doing The Artist's Way. I should say, my dream in 2026 is to be a fiction writer, right? Like it's that's what I do in my spare time. I love to write fiction. So I have just started The Artist's Way. I'm very early into the journey of it. If you believe in creativity and unlocking creativity as being valuable to the world of comms, then I found it an unbelievably interesting tool. And I read a lot of fiction as well, obviously. So where I find fiction to be valuable, and this we could go on about all this all day, but the amount of content that I read in 2026 that I know has been generated by AI. That kind of very kind of short, staccato, in-your-face style is not for me. I'm just incredibly interested in language and language construction. And to me, language should be smooth and feel like it's sort of dripping off your tongue.
And like you've never seen it before, wrapping the world up in a sentence.
Yeah, and reading great fiction books always reminds me of like this is what great language looks like.
Listen, Alex, thanks so much for this. I've really enjoyed having you here on this episode of X Tech.
It's been great. Love the conversation.
And thank you to all of you for joining us on this episode of X Tech. If you'd like to appear as a guest on the show, don't waste a minute. Email us now at xtech@fox.agency. I'd like to thank our whole team of tech experts at Fox Agency for making this podcast possible. I'm Debbie Forster, and you've been listening to X Tech.
Keep exploring the world of tech. Subscribe to our podcast and never miss an episode. To discover more opportunities for global B2B tech brands, visit fox.agency today.